Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our How to Effectively Evaluate a Vendor's Performance webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content Widget, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. All the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of that widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout each session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive the credit, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the live session that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. With us today, we have Hillary Dewhurst, VendMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. She will discuss the essential components of vendor performance management, including understanding the differences between a service level agreement and a key performance indicator. We'll also dive into planning effective performance reviews, addressing performance issues, and engaging your vendor in the performance management process. You'll also see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, links to our Understanding Vendor Performance Metrics and Scorecards ebook and Scorecard template, our 8 Vendor Service Level Agreement Best Practices infographic, and our Vendor Issues and Challenges, What Leverage Do You Have ebook, as well as a link to our library of additional resources in the Related Content widget. With all that being said, I would like to hand it over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everybody. We're so happy you could join us for our webinar today where we will be discussing vendor performance management. We're going to jump right into why it's so important and 4 key components of performance management, and then we'll move through the presentation to talk about metrics, scorecards, vendor performance reviews, and then we'll wrap up with some best practices. Okay, I'm going to say the most important thing right now, and that is the vendor performance management is essential. Okay? If your organization isn't managing vendor performance, it really isn't managing risk. Now, I'm not saying that to make anyone feel like they have an inferior program or lack standards, but all that perfect cybersecurity, the best business continuity plans, most robust financial health aren't going to help you if that vendor doesn't have good performance. And I know that it can be really easy to get solely focused on managing all those risks we identify through the inherent risk assessment, but still forget to consider the risk of non-performance, which is something we can't see until it's actually happening. The truth is, when you think about it, right, we engage vendors for a reason. They're supposed to help us fix a problem or realize an opportunity. And vendor performance management is the key to making sure that those vendors are helping you and your organization meet their strategic goals. For example, let's say I engage a vendor to take over an email campaign that I want to reach a bunch of people and convert them into customers. So first of all, yes, I need to know that they're reaching the targeted users. But what if they're reaching them and the messaging is really bad, and so we're not really converting those individuals to customers? That email agency may have stellar cybersecurity, but in the end, we are wasting our money and a valuable chance of improving our market share. So when it comes to performance management, we always need to verify that the vendor is providing products and services as we expect them to, with the right level of quality and agreed upon price, and that product or service is helping us reach those organizational goals. So by doing this, we can constantly confirm that the benefit to our organization outweighs the risk posed by the relationship. So how do we get started with this process? Well, I want you to start with your organizational objectives or goals. And I know everyone wants to jump in with metrics and SLAs, but good performance management really starts before you ink the contract. It really even starts before you select your vendor. It starts with understanding how that vendor is going to support your organizational objectives or goals. So let's consider that every organization has some objectives or goals. Here are some examples, right? Maybe we want to increase revenue or diversify our revenue streams or break into new customer segments. Maybe we want to increase our net promoter score. You're familiar with these type of things. But we should be able to understand how any one vendor contributes to or supports the organization in meeting those goals. That understanding and articulation is really the foundation of excellent performance management. Good vendor performance management has at least these 4 components. So the first one is established and agreed upon performance measures. So these identify what specifically the vendor is responsible for. What's important here is that both parties agree upon what will be measured and if there will be any penalties for misperformance. The second thing is data collection and reporting. So we need to access and review data relevant to that performance. That data may be system reports, stakeholder feedback, inventory levels, customer satisfaction scores, defect reports, all of that kind of stuff is data that we can review. But both parties must agree on the data types and the sources. Keep in mind that there should never be any surprises here. Both parties should be able to access and review the data. The next thing, very important, is our performance review meetings. So once we agree upon metrics, data, and reporting, we need to establish our performance review meetings. Now keep in mind these are formal meetings, right? They're scheduled at regular and predictable intervals and are specifically designed to discuss and review performance. These are not a casual discussion out on a golf course. Now it is okay if you devote a segment of another meeting, say a business review or production meeting, and dedicate that for vendor performance, but make sure that you can evidence that these meetings are happening. And by evidence, I mean you have notes, scorecards, action items, and the status of any open issues, because you always need to be prepared to show those details to an auditor or an examiner at some point, especially for critical and high-risk vendors. Finally, whenever there are performance issues, they need to be tracked and managed. And by managed, I mean we're addressing them ASAP. If, for example, our vendor doesn't meet a contractual service agreement, we would need to document that and make note of what the expected financial or other penalties will be and if our organization has been appropriately compensated. Maybe there isn't a huge issue, but the vendor just fell right under that acceptable range for a KPI. We'd still need to document that and include the reason or the root cause for the failure. If actions are to be taken to improve performance, record those and note that due date for remediation. And just to make sure that everyone is taking issue remediation seriously, any issues that are at risk or past due should be escalated to senior management. So let's take a look on the next slide to see how we start to utilize these components. Now, we have been told that examples can be very helpful in these webinars. So today, we're going to work with an example throughout the presentation. Now, this is a fictitious company called Birthday Bash Incorporated, and they've made a business out of planning and delivering birthday party packages. Of course, these packages come with a cake, but there's been some issues with those cakes. And you can read about it in the box on the left. But they're now engaging a new cake vendor called Kpi Categories. So when we think about Birthday Bash Incorporated, let's look at some of their organizational goals. First of all, they want to deliver best-in-class party services and products. They want to remove the stress of party planning. They want to wow the customer. They want to increase sales by 10% over last year, increase repeat business by 20%, and increase referrals to account for 15% of new business. And right from the beginning, we want to think about how those strategic goals or objectives are going to travel down. They're going to trickle down to our vendors, and we're going to be able to distill them into vendor targets. So why do we think about that first? Well, first of all, like I said, the vendors have a role to play. They're there to help you meet your goals or contribute to the process that's going to meet those goals. They can only do that when their directive is clear and they have a way to measure success. The second thing is that Those vendor performance objectives and targets help you articulate the strategic value of that vendor relationship. And finally, giving your vendor these targets really helps them have a bigger mission that goes beyond just a purely transactional relationship. So when we look at the new bakery's targets, it looks like they are on the hook to help increase repeat business, help improve customer referrals, and really wow the customer, the celebrant, and the guest. So now that we've covered those targets, let's start talking about metrics. When we're talking about vendor performance monitoring and metrics, it's really important to learn how to design and use these tools effectively. Understanding the differences between, say, a target or goal, or knowing if a measure is subjective or objective can really make all the difference in effective performance management. It's really important, for example, to know when to use a service level versus when a KPI will be sufficient. Now keep in mind, as we go through, that how you and your organization manage vendor performance, it's totally up to you. You determine the metrics, the data capture, reporting, and issue management, and that's exactly how it should be. And some of the concepts I'm sharing with you today may not work perfectly for you, but that's okay, because there are endless opinions and methods for performance management. What I'm going to share today are really some of the tried and true methods that have proved to be really effective during my third-party risk management career. We're going to talk about metrics just a little bit. The first thing is that metrics come in two flavors, right? They're either objective or subjective. Now, we'll get into more detail about each type in just a minute. But I want to say, first of all, that both types of these metrics are valid, and both can be used when you're talking about your vendor performance. However, we should ensure that objective or quantitative metrics account for the majority of our metrics. So let's talk about both types to understand why. So objective metrics are also known as quantitative, which you can remember this because it has the root word of quantity, meaning something that can be counted or measured. So obviously we can count things or volumes or capacity, time, etc. But when it comes to measuring performance, these objective or quantitative measurements should account for most of your metrics. So I'm going to tell you why. Because you get a consistent and comparable measure that allows you to see performance over time or within a context. So let's use our Birthday Bash Incorporated example. Let's say we have a contract for the baker to provide the right flavor, decorative style, and size of cake at least 2 hours before the planned start of the party. Now, with all of those elements, I can clearly determine if you brought me the right style of cake, the right size cake, the right flavor of cake, and if it's on time. But what if I tell you to bring me a beautiful and delicious cake? Okay, now we're wading into subjective or qualitative metrics. Now, I just want to take a pause. If you're asking yourself why on earth we are talking about birthday cakes, say, versus NPS scores or something more relatable for your organization, I'm going to let you in on something. So first of all, I talk about this stuff a lot. So mixing it up doesn't only keep it interesting for me, but more importantly, it helps everyone really focus on the concepts. So everybody else loves to talk about widgets, but given my choice between a widget and a cake, I will take a cake every time. So we'll continue with our cake example as we move through the presentation. Now let's talk about subjective metrics. So subjective metrics are just that. They are subjective. And they are accounting for something that is observed, experienced, or felt, which can be a lot more difficult to measure. And they can be extremely variable depending on the perspective of those doing the measuring. So let's go back to our cake example. Our customer ordered a chocolate unicorn cake. And the cake vendor believes that the unicorn cake is perfect and beautiful, but the mother of the birthday girl is not happy because the image of the unicorn on that cake is a little more cartoonish than what she had in mind. Maybe she wanted some really detailed fantasy creature. Sure, the bakery provided a chocolate unicorn cake that can serve 10 to 12 people on time, but is it fair to derail their whole performance because of the image on the cake? Probably not. Now, that's not to say that the look of the cake isn't important, because if you've ever had a 7-year-old girl, you know that it is. But if we haven't done the work or taken the time to define the desired look of the cake, we aren't really being fair. It's not that subjective metrics shouldn't hold as much weight as objective ones, but they should always be balanced and supported by objective ones. And it's also important to consider that the subjective measurement can change depending on the mood someone is in. So that mother, for example, who hated the unicorn cake, could have really had a very bad morning. And so that little unicorn detail was really exaggerated for her, which made her opinion of the cake and maybe the whole party really different than it might have been on another day. And you'll see this a lot in customer service. So you could measure your call center just by how your customers feel. But if you're running a collections call center, for example, your customers may not feel that great to begin with. So whenever you can, make sure subjective metrics are supported and balanced by objective metrics. Now we know the basic difference between subjective and objective. Let's talk about service level agreements. So some people use the terms SLA, service level agreement, and KPI, key performance indicator, interchangeably, and they're not the same thing. So let me tell you about this. Service level agreements are documented performance agreements, and they represent the must-haves for the engagement. You need to think of a service level agreement as a deal breaker, absolutely non-negotiable, because there's usually some sort of agreed upon penalty if they aren't met, right? These are legally in the contract. In many cases, that penalty will probably be a rebate or discount or other sort of financial remedy. But there may be other treatments that might get determined between the organization and the vendor. In the case of our bakery, we might have a service level agreement that says any cake represented as gluten-free must be made in an isolated kitchen free of any gluten contamination. So this is really crucial for removing unnecessary liability and for safety, but also ensuring that the customers are not harmed and that they're satisfied. So this would be a big deal. So we would probably want an SLA for a gluten-free kitchen. A good rule of thumb here is that service level agreements are developed with the vendor during the contract negotiation, and that the term service level agreement is only reserved for those requirements that are in the contract. And while you think about that, we have our first poll of the day. Jessie?
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, does your organization have established formal vendor performance monitoring practices? Yes, we have established metrics, reporting, and regular reviews with our vendors. Yes, we have established metrics, reporting, and regular reviews, but only for vendors that are high risk, high spend, or considered critical. Partial, some performance monitoring takes place, but no, not for all vendors or practices are not formalized. No, or you're unsure. And Hillary, it looks like we have some time now to answer one of the questions that has come in so far.
Okay, great. Let's do it.
All right, that question is, do we have to do vendor performance management for all vendors or just critical?
Well, technically, you should be doing it for all vendors to some degree. But if you're in a situation where you absolutely have minimal resources, definitely prioritize your critical vendors. Now, I want to not give anyone the impression that that means it's just okay. Your high-risk vendors have a lot of things you need to keep an eye on, and ideally both of those, critical and high risk, will be monitored formally once a quarter. If you want to do your moderate, you can also do them 1 to 2 times a year. And for your low, you may not need to do it depending on the product or service. I hope that helps.
Thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are those results. And by the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or a heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, as a reminder, in the Related Content widget, you'll find informative resources such as our Understanding Vendor Performance Metrics and Scorecards ebook and Scorecard template. Vendor scorecards are a valuable tool to help you track and measure vendor performance, so we encourage you to check those helpful resources. Okay, Hillary, I'll pass it back to you.
Great. Let's pick back up by looking at some SLA examples. So again, remember these are your must-haves, your non-negotiables, the deal breakers. You know, you're not a bakery, you might have other things like response time, uptime, or repair time. You know, cost might be an SLA, or safety, or customer satisfaction. Maybe you want to have their cybersecurity controls as an SLA. All of these things could be memorialized in your contract. But it's really important to note that not all SLAs have punitive consequences. For some specific services, SLAs are commonly used to incent above average performance. So you'll see this a lot in customer service call centers or collection services. For every month, maybe the customer call center is above 90% of customer satisfaction, they might get a bonus, right? And that bonus could be sliding scale depending on, you know, what the midpoint is considered average and everything up from that. So keep in mind that SLAs can also be used to incent good performance. Okay, how do we make our service level agreements effective, right? How do we structure them? Well, the first thing is we want to define those overall objectives, right? We want to connect the dots back for the vendor. We want to leave them no questions as to why what they're doing matters, right? The next thing is we always want to create those service level agreements in collaboration with the vendor, right? So if you go off and create some unachievable SLA, one of two things is going to happen. The vendor's either going to sign up for it and miss it, or they're not going to sign up for it. And that doesn't put you in a very good position. That's not to say that you should have low standards. You shouldn't. But SLAs do require some give and take on both sides. And we definitely want a good description of the product or service, right? There should be where it's going, what it is, who's getting it, when is it required. So let's take a look at a few more. We also want to identify the performance standards, right? What specific KPIs are we using to substantiate the SLA? What specific measurements are we asking for? We really want to be clear so that everyone's on the same page, because per the next bullet, we have to identify compensation or service credit. So when you miss that very clearly spelled out level of performance, this is what you owe our organization. This is how it will be paid. Will it be a rebate or discount? And when it's to be paid, is it immediately? Is it within 30 days, the next billing cycle? Alternatively, if you're going to use those SLAs for incentives, you want to do the same thing for the vendor. Spell it out very clearly. But the last thing here is that a really effective SLA defines critical failure, right? So what constitutes a critical failure where we can cancel the contract? So that's SLAs. Let's jump into key performance indicators, or KPIs. So another very widely used type of metric is the KPI, or the key performance indicator. These metrics are generally used to measure performance and indicate trends. And similar to SLAs, they should measure the most important aspects of performance. KPIs are also used to substantiate certain SLAs, but all KPIs are not necessarily detailed in the contract and don't have a specific penalty, right? So the KPI can give you a lot of really valuable information, especially when it comes to spotting problems and potential root causes. You don't have to have a ton of KPIs, right? If you're having like 500 KPIs, that might be too much. What you need to do is measure the things that matter most And that can be different aspects of the vendor's performance in terms of quality, service, timeliness, costs, etc. So now let's take a look at some KPIs that are going to be specific to our imaginary cake vendor. You'll remember that our KPI should tie back to those performance targets we discussed earlier. In this case, our cake vendor has 5 specific KPIs that we're going to be measuring. The first is the quality of the cake. So we're going to measure from a customer satisfaction survey that rates how delicious the cakes are. So maybe that's on a scale of 1 to 10. In this particular KPI, we want 80% or more of the cakes to be rated as delicious. Okay, subjective metric here. Now, we also want the cake orders to be accurate. That means the flavor, size, and ingredients. We have a lot riding on these cakes. So that KPI is set at 95% or higher, and that's an objective metric. Since we're always marketing that we're on time and we have this 2-hour window, we have a very high expectation that the cake vendor is going to get those cakes there on time. So we're asking them to hit 98% of the time or better. We also want really fun and cool cake designs that people can only get through Birthday Bash. And so 70% of the cake designs that the bakery is doing should be exclusive to us and our customers. Now this is listed as an objective KPI, but it might be really hard to substantiate with data, like what is exclusive. So we may want to think about this KPI in the future, and then we also may want to change it from objective to subjective. We want repeat business. So we want our customers to keep being delighted and coming back to us. That is completely subjective. So looking over these metrics and kind of thinking about our example, maybe you can think about a few more objective metrics we could add, etc. So maybe you're not so excited about the metrics for the cake vendor. So now let's look at some example KPIs that might be more relevant for your business. So here is a list of potential KPI categories and examples. They might be more relevant for you. So we have a couple different areas here. Starting with marketing, we might want to measure online engagement, page views, search engine ranking. In IT, maybe we want to look at downtime or number of information security incidents or help desk resolution. Operational metrics, we can have a lot of those: time to market, waste, defect, cycle time, operating expense, rework. And customer, we may want to look at our Net Promoter Score or customer complaints or customer retention. Remember, the KPIs you choose for the vendor is totally up to you and your organization. But here are good rules to follow. 1, structure KPIs so that they have a connection back to your organizational goals and objectives and are measuring the performance that matters most. KPIs should be able to be validated through reliable, accurate, and timely data. We want to use the SMART formula so that specific, measurable, achievable, and realistic and timely. I'm going to stop here just for a moment to say that achievable and realistic are super important. No product or service is going to be 100% perfect all of the time. So when we expect that it should be 100%, we're just setting everyone up for failure. That's not to say that you should have low standards. You shouldn't, but you should be realistic about it. Next thing is to track your KPIs over time to help you spot trends and show patterns. So a good example might be, let's say we have a retail online store, we have a call center, and it operates really well from, say, January to October. But starting in November, those numbers always seem to take a dive. Well, obviously, you and the vendor could probably sit down and determine that maybe there's not enough personnel and calls are going unanswered or it's taking too long to answer them. Most importantly, effective KPIs are always created in tandem with the vendor because they're the ones that have to achieve the performance. And I think most of us can relate to a situation where, you know, we're with our manager and we have the opportunity to identify and discuss our KPIs versus just having them handed down to us. You know which situation is preferred and which one works better. And while you're considering that, I believe it's time for another poll. Jessie?
Our second poll question of the day is, does your organization require contractual SLAs for critical or high-risk vendors? Yes, for all critical or high-risk vendors. Partially for some vendors, but depending on the product or service. No, or you're unsure. And Hillary, I have another question here that I think we can go ahead and answer.
Let's hear it.
That question is, can we cancel a contract if a vendor misses an SLA?
Well, that depends on the contract. So when it comes to service level agreements, as part of putting that in your contract, you need to put the conditions under which you would be able to cancel due to an SLA being missed. Generally speaking, you don't cancel a contract because they miss one SLA. But if it becomes a habitual thing, they're just not cutting it, then if your contract is structured appropriately, you would be within your rights. Some contracts have something called termination for cause or convenience, but most of us do not write our contracts that way. So it's really important to, one, not pull the trigger after one SLA miss, and two, make sure your contracts are structured so you do have that leverage should you need it.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. I would also like to point your attention to the related content widget, where you can find our 8 vendor service level agreement best practices infographic available for download. I'll hand it back to you, Hillary.
Thank you, Jessie. Let's talk about data and reporting for a minute, because those two elements are really the foundation of any performance evaluation. Now, in a lot of cases, your vendor will be providing data to substantiate their performance. That's fine. However, when you're reliant on a data source, you need to occasionally test that data to make sure it's accurate, especially where it's one you don't control. I personally have experienced this one. So performance data said one thing, but internal operational data said something very different. It turned out that an equation had the decimal point in the wrong place, and the variance over time went crazy. So we had to get everyone in and pull everything apart. If the team had just thought about testing that data before there was a giant error, that situation would not have occurred. So test all your data occasionally. Make sure that everything adds up and that you are in fact measuring the right data factors. Another really important consideration is how often you should pull and review that performance data. So I like to say that a good rule of thumb is built around the service cycle or the transaction length. So let me use an example. Suppose your call center gets about 2,000 calls a week. Each one of those calls is going to contribute to the vendor's performance and your NPS rating. And each one of those calls presents the opportunity for something to go well or to go wrong, and in some cases, very wrong. In this situation, we'd want to look at that data more frequently, because if we don't spot trouble early, there's a lot of opportunities to go wrong. To illustrate this, we have approximately 8,000 opportunities a month. What if 1 in 4 calls was below your quality requirement? You could spot that in the first week and immediately start remediating it. Or if you wait a month to review it, you find that now you have 2,000 unhappy customers. Maybe you only look at it quarterly and you find you have 6,000 unhappy customers. So that probably isn't the best plan. So consider the service cycle or transaction frequency when you're deciding how often to review the data supporting the performance. When it comes to formalizing your performance review, you know you need to have a documented meeting. You need to do this with your vendor on a regular and predictable basis, and you should do the formal review at least quarterly for your critical and high-risk vendors. You can do it maybe once or twice a year for your moderate vendors, and maybe not at all for your low vendors, depending on the product or service. Now, I want to emphasize that if there is an issue that pops up, calling your vendor up and saying, hey, we got a problem is not the same as having your formal performance review. And I want to emphasize that you should not wait until just before your vendor performance review to look at how they're performing. That is the point of ongoing monitoring, right? That it's consistent. And the best way to avoid any unpleasant surprises is to pay attention to what is going on with those vendors at all times. All right, so now we can start discussing scorecards. All right, to talk about vendor scorecard components. First of all, this may be one of those areas where your organization has a completely different way of doing that, and that's fine. For the purposes of this conversation, I really want to focus on those of you that are new to vendor scorecards or are implementing scorecards at your organization for the first time. If you're an existing scorecard pro, bear with us. A lot of this information will still apply. So the other thing to consider, there's just as many ways to put together a scorecard as there are stars in the sky. And there are countless templates and services and software offerings out there. But I want to start with a really very basic and simple way to assemble a scorecard. Now, there are a couple things to keep in mind here. The first of which is that a good scorecard has all the essential data on a single page. You can, of course, present all the supporting data with that scorecard, but don't expect most folks to look at it more than that first page. So let's say that you include performance scorecards for your critical vendors as part of a quarterly board reporting package. A lot of organizations have anywhere from 15 to 30 critical vendors, maybe more. So what you include must be concise, easy to read, and to the point. So your readers should be able to look at that scorecard and get a really good feel about what is going on with that vendor. Now, the elements that I recommend here are, we want to state our target. We want to talk about service level agreements. Now, if we don't have room to list them all, we can talk about where there were exceptions. We want those key performance indicators. What are the things that are supporting those objectives or goals and could substantiate the service level agreements? If we have other metrics, we can include those. We want open issues. If there's issues, we want to see some remediation plans, some highlights of that, open issues and emerging risk or issues, as well as a place for vendor commentary and a summary statement. Now, let's look at a scorecard that uses all of this information. Okay, we have a sample scorecard we've put together for Baketastic Cakery, our cake vendor. And this is a very simple scorecard to be used as an example. Right at the top, we have the reporting period and those performance targets. Right up front, we should be saying what we're holding this vendor accountable for, how they're helping us meet our objectives. The next thing is about SLAs. So have they been met? Remember, these are the contracted performance measures that are non-negotiable. We could list all the SLAs if we have space on the page, but in most cases we won't. So we can list exceptions and be just as effective. And oh shoot, looks like they didn't meet that SLA for a certified gluten-free kitchen. That's a problem. The next thing below are the KPIs we discussed earlier. We list the goal and the resulting score. I'm also looking at them for multiple quarters. Why? So I can identify trends. I'm also using red, yellow, and green to help the reader differentiate what is happening at first glance. So let's take a deeper dive on this. First, the quality of cakes rated as delicious. Well, they've had a strong showing all year until the last quarter. Accuracy and timely delivery look pretty much the same. And exclusivity has never been great and is barely above the target now. Now, I want to pause on this one just for a moment. This goes back to having those realistic and achievable goals. And here we look at this goal and they've barely made it or they've not made it. To me, this would be an opportunity to go back and re-examine if this is in fact the right thing to measure, or if the data we're using to measure it is using the right elements, the right data factors. So use your scorecards to also help you figure out if these are the right performance measures. All right, so the next thing here is the customer delight or the wow factor. And this has been pretty unpredictable and seems to be on the decline. Below that, we have some stakeholder feedback from our production coordinator letting us know that because of these missed deliveries, we had to issue rebates to customers, and we can guess that those missed deliveries are probably lowering the scores for customer delight also. So let's look at some of the remediation plans that they have around those particular issues. The first one is that there was apparently a problem with the gluten-free kitchen, so they're subcontracting another kitchen until the existing one is certified. And they've also scheduled 3 customer focus groups and cake tasting, maybe to talk about that wow factor. And they've also have a dedicated production planning manager that can probably help with some of those delivery issues that are popping up. We also have emerging risks or issues. So from our perspective, there's declining performance in the fourth quarter overall. And we know that the communication regarding that gluten-free kitchen was really bad. But more than that, they lost 2 key personnel, including the senior baker and the buyer. So that could have some real impacts on some of their KPIs. So here's something very important right below that, is we want to give a place for the vendor to formally comment on the scorecard. And this is so valuable because it forces a discussion and it forces a response from the vendor. So let's say what they have to say about fourth quarter. It looks like they're acknowledging the issues, they're listing some root causes, and they've put some specifics for remediating those issues. This section can also give us additional information for things that we should keep an eye on. So they're talking about doing additional training and that they've hired a new production manager. We want to go back and see the evidence of that training. Who's backing who up? You know, when did the production manager start? Did the issues resolved? Did our timeliness improve? But finally, we have the vendor manager summary, right? And they're basically telling us that, yes, there were some issues. We both recognize them. The vendor looks back on track to take care of them. And this is also the section where if I were a vendor manager and I thought they were really tanking, I might put something in there formally about we may need to reconsider the contract or change some of the KPIs. You know, we're having issues or we're having issues that look like they're being reported. But we want that vendor manager to put their sort of summary statement in there. Because if I'm a board member or I'm sitting on the risk committee, even though you've been nice enough to put this all on one page, I may not even be reading the whole page. So just make sure you put a summary in there. This simple scorecard is painting a pretty good picture of what happened, why it happened, and what is being done to address the issues. So someone who's not familiar with the vendor can get a really good idea of the vendor's performance. And as you can see, this is really pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. So hopefully this example gives you some food for thought on your scorecards and how to start organizing them and developing them. But right now, it is time for our last poll of the day. Jessie?
Our next poll question is, does your organization have a formal and documented vendor issue management tracking and reporting process? Yes for critical vendors only. Yes for all critical and high-risk vendors. Partially, some issues are tracked. No, there is not a formal process. Or you're not sure. And Hillary, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience.
All right.
The question is, are scorecards a regulatory requirement?
You know, I can't think of a single regulation that says you have to have an actual scorecard. But most of the major regulations do say that you need evidence of performance monitoring. So your scorecard is a fantastic piece of evidence. So, you could interpret that as, yes, I need a scorecard, but there is nothing in the regulations that I can think of that says you need an actual scorecard. You could demonstrate that you were monitoring performance in a number of ways. So that's my answer. I'm sorry, it's not more clear, but no, you don't have to have an actual scorecard that I'm aware of.
And here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question, as it is interesting to see what everyone has to say. Before we move on, I would like to point you all to our Vendor Issues and Challenges, What Leverage Do You Have ebook that is available for download in the Related Content widget. Let's continue with the presentation.
All right, coming back to our scorecard example, there were some performance issues, and we had a missed SLA. So when there's a missed SLA, you need to determine if the penalties are going to be applied and document what the expected remedy is and when it's going to happen. So they owe us a 30% discount. On the next billing cycle, you need to go back and verify that that happened. So that information should be retained as part of the vendor record. And especially if you're finding that they're having to give you these SLAs every couple months, these rebates or remedies, because over time we might say, you know what, this vendor performance is really uneven, these missed SLAs, so we might want to think about a new vendor here. The scorecard also includes some very high-level description of the remediation plan, but that is not a substitute for a detailed remediation plan that's documented, that's between the vendor manager and the vendor. And again, that must be retained for the vendor records. I do want to point something out that's really super important here, and that is that scorecards and remediation plans are not a substitute for formal issue tracking. So issue tracking should be its own process, and that information from the performance issue should be put into that process and tracked at the company level with all the dates on it, so that as things come up, people aren't going to look at 20 scorecards to determine if there's a remediation plan. That issue management and tracking has to have its own dedicated process. Okay, so now you know what to do, but who's responsible for doing what? So first and foremost, the vendor owner is responsible and accountable for effectively managing vendor performance. That means managing issues and their remediation and holding their vendor accountable. As I say, the buck stops here for performance management. Your third-party risk or vendor risk management team needs to oversee that process, making sure that everything is documented, tracking the issues, and holding the vendor owner accountable. And then finally, senior management is still responsible for making sure that the policy is enforced. So if your vendor management is part of the policy, you're not getting the results, they should be able to track someone down and hold them accountable and get that taken care of. So they are responsible for overseeing the whole process, both what your team is doing, your vendor owners are doing, and making sure everyone is doing their job. Okay, we've given you so much information today, so let me just wrap up with a few best practices. The first of which is be able to articulate how that vendor is supporting your organizational goals, right? That sets the stage for everything. Use SLAs in your contract for the most important or non-negotiable requirements. Balance those subjective and objective performance measures. Remember, we want to keep most of them objective if possible. You want to track your KPIs over time to look at the trends, because that can really help you tie together some loose ends and spot root causes. Make sure to test your data periodically, whether it's your data or the vendor's data, just to make sure nothing crazy is happening out there. Consider that service cycle transaction length when you're determining how often to look at those reports, right? Don't let something with multiple transactions pile up for months at a time. If you can stop something early, do it. Always document and track your vendor performance issues, not just in the scorecards, but in your official issue management tracking process. And require documented remediation plans, right? We're having a big issue. I want to see some details. I want to see the who, what, why, where, when, and how. And we need to monitor that those actions are taking place. And finally, keep your scorecards simple. Again, not everyone's going to read all the information. And you want to give them just a quick snapshot of what's really going on with the vendor. And with that, I'll thank everyone for their attendance today and turn it back over to Jessie for wrap-up and Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I want to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Hillary for her time in sharing some really important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On August 9th, how to classify who is a critical vendor at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and 2 webinars on August 23rd. One at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, which is our Understanding Vendor Business Continuity, Disaster Recovery, and Pandemic Plan session, and another session at 2 p.m. Eastern Time covering a deep dive into business vendor continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans. We hope you'll be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in a copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Hillary, the next question is, should we always have both subjective and objective metrics, or can we just have objective ones?
You can just have objective metrics. I mean, I'm a fan of getting the most fact-based, repeatable metrics possible. Sometimes it's not possible, but yes, if you have to have just one, objective is fine.
Okay, great. Next question. My company doesn't use scorecards, but we use a report to identify which vendors didn't meet their KPIs. Is this acceptable?
It would be acceptable, provided they're easily accessible and you could give them to an auditor or an examiner. Sometimes individual scorecards work best for a smaller group, but let's say your senior leadership's looking over that. A report in that case may be a better option. So yes, it's acceptable.
Perfect. Our next question. What if a vendor disagrees with your performance management review?
That never happens. No, of course it does happen. And there's a couple ways to go about it. So the first, there's a few things I would do just to get ready for that conversation. Go back and make sure that your KPIs and SLAs are clearly spelled out, that there's been a conversation. So everyone's on the same page about what needed to be accomplished. Then the second piece of that is reviewing the data that substantiates that performance, right? So if you have, this is what we're supposed to do, this is how we prove we do it, those two elements should be pretty undisputable. But when it gets right down to it, when we're in some of those subjective metrics, or we haven't really defined everything that well, there can be disagreements. And so if nothing else and all is kind of going not well, you may have to refer to your contract. But I would always make sure you're checking that your KPIs are clear and the measurements are clear and the data sources are clear. You're both on the same page before you have that discussion.
Okay, great. Our next question. What should be the frequency of vendor evaluation?
It really depends on a couple things. One is how critical they are to your organization, right? So those very critical vendors, we want to make sure we're really on top of that. And the same is true for high risk, really. For critical and high risk, you really want to make sure that at a minimum, you're having those formal performance reviews. Now, how often you look at the performance data really does depend on that transaction length or the service cycle. So a lot of transactions in a little time, you're going to need to look at that data more often than every quarter. For moderates, I do think it's fine to do it once or twice a year, depending on the service. And for low risk, you may not need to do a performance review because their performance may be as simple as we order paper, was it the right price? There's not a lot of performance. It's a kind of either or. So I hope that answers that question.
That's great. Thanks. Our next question. Should subjective and objective performance metrics be considered for all vendors, including those that have been considered low risk?
You know, again, it's really about the product and service. To do as many objective metrics as possible because it's hard to argue with them because it's not about someone's opinion. It's about something happened or it didn't. We could count it. Like I said, with the critical, high, and moderate, you want to have the right metrics in place. When you get down to those low-risk metrics, then you shouldn't look at their performance. I'm saying you have to balance out the value of setting up all those KPIs and possibly trying to monitor something that doesn't have a lot of data or, you know, it's just like, hey, here's your invoice and your delivery receipt. You may find that there's not a lot of extra value in doing this risk, and that time could be better spent really diving into your high risk and critical vendors. So again, it's totally up to you and your organization, but I personally don't believe that all low risk vendors need performance management.
Perfect. Our next question. How would you suggest initiating the SLA discussion with potential penalties for a vendor that you have been working with for a long time and has not had strict measures in place previously?
Well, I think the right time to do that is as the contract's coming up for renewal. If you have a more immediate need to renegotiate the contract, you know, I would be very open. I always felt with my vendors that honesty is the best policy, and if it's a matter of this is something we're trying to do for our organization, we're trying to get more rigor around our service level agreements, and we're really trying to hold people to them. So this is something that's coming up. But another helpful plan that you might put in place is to really look at what's common service level agreements for the. If they're pretty common in that industry, yet you don't have any with your vendor, they shouldn't feel that surprised if you bring up the need to have them at some point.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one more question, and that is, what is the difference between SLAs and KPIs? They sound exactly the same to me.
So a KPI can be any performance metric, and it should be measuring the most important things. But service level agreements are specifically called out in your contract. They are like, you know, part of the contract. Whereas KPIs might be covered under something that says, you know, more general language about acceptable performance. But KPIs are SLAs are very specific. So the action is, what the accepted level of performance is, and the penalty for not meeting that performance. So they are different.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Hillary for her time and great content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics such as vendor performance management to assist you. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set up your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request a CPE credit. On behalf of InMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.